This absolute beast is Acer's X32 FP, a 4K 160Hz IPS gaming monitor that offers pretty incredible top-shelf specs. I mean, we're talking about a mini LED backlight, 1200 nits of peak brightness in HDR content, a claimed 0.7 millisecond minimum response time, AMD Freesync Premium Pro, massive color gamut coverage, and a delta E of less than 1 from the factory. And all that can be yours for, at least at the time of filming, around £1,200. £1 per nit. Amazing! Of course, just reading from the spec sheet doesn't tell you the whole story, so let's dive into this and see if it's actually worth that hefty price tag. I'll start with the physical. This is one chunky monitor. It's thick, or deep, I should say, with a wide yet stable stand. You've got plenty of adjustment in the form of an impressively large amount of tilt for some reason, along with reasonable height adjust and decent swivel room too. Styling wise, this is clearly a gaming display with the sharp angled lines streaking across the back of the panel. I think it looks pretty good, if a little imposing due to its size. You have a pretty crazy number of inputs too. 4 HDMI ports, 1 display port, and 1 USB-C port for both, USB, but also DisplayPort Alt mode. Add to that a 4-port USB 3 hub, 2 of the ports are on the left-hand side of the monitor, and you've got a whole lot of I/O to play with here. Surprisingly, despite its heft, this doesn't have a power supply built in. You have to use this rather chunky one externally instead. And lastly, on the physical, the OSD controls are on the right-hand side at the back, including a joystick style switch and a couple of buttons above that. Now let's move on to my favourite topic, response times. Acer is quite proud of its response time claims. You'll find 1 millisecond grey to grey plastered everywhere, and like I mentioned, they even boast 0.7 millisecond grey to grey minimum. Now, naturally, I fired up my open source response time tool, available at osrtt.com for all of your monitor testing needs, and I ran it through its paces. Starting with no overdrive, you wouldn't expect this to be all that fast, and yeah, it isn't. The panel averaged 8.7 milliseconds, a full 2.5 milliseconds slower than the refresh rate window. Now that isn't actually all that bad. Nearly 9 milliseconds isn't exactly fast, but anything that is close to the refresh rate window means that there shouldn't be absolutely horrendous or heinous ghosting, and a quick look at the UFO test confirms that that's the case. There is one ghosted frame on screen, but the current frame does get most of the way rendered before the next one starts being drawn, so it's not all that bad. So that mode is a little slow, but nowhere near our magic 0.7 millisecond minimum, so let's crank up the overdrive. Now there are 2 settings here, normal and extreme. Normal introduces a remarkable amount of overshoot in the mid-range, with some errors being as high as 42 RGB values off. That's really quite bad considering there are only 255 RGB values to begin with, and that means that the response times aren't actually that much faster when you include how long it takes to actually come to a rest fully. If you were to ignore the overshoot time, the average drops to just 4.6 milliseconds, or about half of what the off setting ran at, but I mean that isn't exactly ideal either. Here's what that looks like on the UFO test. The new frame does get rendered a little faster for sure, but the inverted ghosting that you can see behind the UFO is often more distracting, and it's pretty obvious here. So if that's normal, what does extreme look like? Bad, really bad. The overshoot is so extreme that all bar the min and max transitions are affected. The worst is 77 RGB values too high, as in it was going for this kind of grey, but ended up at basically full white like this instead. That's kind of awful. If you include the overshoot time, as I think you should, especially in this kind of heinous case, well, the average response time is actually up at 9.26 milliseconds. If you decide that the overshoot shouldn't be included for some crazy reason, the average is still only 3.6 milliseconds, with the minimum not even reaching their quoted average of 1 millisecond at 1.2, let alone the minimum of 0.7. The thing is, this panel isn't all that bad. I think that the normal overdrive mode should be tuned down a little bit and you'd actually have a perfectly reasonable, experience. But for Acer to claim this is anywhere near a 1 millisecond or 0.7 millisecond minimum panel is just false advertising. Acer isn't alone here. This is pretty much industry standard. But that doesn't make it any less, any less culpable. If you're wondering what that looks like on the UFO test, yeah, you get 2 inverted ghosting frames on screen. 2! I have no idea how Acer could have been happy to publish and release this. Okay, let's talk about something a little more positive. The input latency is actually pretty good. OSRTT reckons it's around 3 milliseconds of on-display latency, with none of the results taking longer than 1 frame, so that's spot on. The time sleuth reckons it's more like 2 milliseconds, but either of those results are pretty good and well within 1 frame, so that's perfectly fine. Both of those factors translate into a pretty decent gaming experience overall. The larger panel at 32 inches, the 4K resolution, the 160Hz refresh rates, all adds up to a pretty immersive and, pretty enjoyable experience and good time playing. I had no trouble enjoying anything from Rainbow Six Siege and other FPS style games to more scenic and racing games like Dirt 5. It's a pretty good all-rounder. It isn't exactly, your esports pro monitor, but I mean, you're not expecting it to be, and because it's a very good all-rounder, I think it fits quite well with the category that it's sort of trying to be in. I also think that the colours might be the strongest suit here, with well over 100% coverage of the Adobe RGB spectrum, and almost 100% coverage of the DCI-P3 spectrum as well. That's no mean feat, but this'll do it without a sweat. Brightness is actually better than quoted as well. Acer says 400 nits in SDR, I measured more like 500, and that's excellent and plenty enough for even a relatively bright room. The HDR brightness isn't something I'm equipped to measure, but Simon from TFT Central, who's had this in already, and whose article I'll link in the description, says that it can hit those figures. Contrast is sadly lacking for me though, at least in SDR, with just 770 to 1 due to pretty high black levels. And that's something that I noticed while using it as well. Content with black areas are still very much grey, and the darker shades, especially of greys, can be very difficult to make out between each other. Colour accuracy is pretty good as well, with an average delta E of 1.57, although the darker shades of grey still struggle to be accurate here, with delta E's of over 2, which isn't quite ideal. Still, especially for a gaming display, this is pretty spot on. Now, I mentioned that this has a mini LED backlight, and it does. The problem is the zone count. You have just 576 zones, which means that haloing on such a large panel is pretty obvious. Here's a somewhat extreme example, but you can clearly see a considerable amount of light around the box, especially as it moves. I tried to use the local dimming mode while watching content, but it was just too distracting for me personally. I mean, you essentially have a grid of what I'd guess is 32 by 18 zones across the panel. I mean, that means that each zone is about 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters, compared to 8.3 million pixels that are about 0.02 centimeters wide, and yeah, there's a bit of a disparity there. And I think that brings me nicely onto my main sticking point with this thing. Why not just buy an OLED? Okay, a 32-inch OLED in particular isn't in the same price bracket right now, at more like £3,000, but 27-inch 1440p OLEDs are around £1,000, and a 42-inch 4K OLED is about the same. You might be worried about burn-in, and I mean, sure, but for the average user, it really isn't a massive problem. The upside though are perfect blacks, often very similar color performance, infinitely better HDR experiences, and of course literally instant response times. The X32 FP isn't bad, but if it was an OLED panel instead of this still very impressive IPS one, I can't help but feel it'd be a much better experience. Still, if you are dead set on 4K at 32 inches and don't have $3 to drop on a new OLED, this seems like a pretty decent option. I do hope they offer a firmware update to calm down the normal overdrive mode, because it's kind of not really usable in that mode. I would like it to be a bit more usable, but also I wouldn't hold my hopes up too high for that one. Everything else, save for the black levels, is pretty good, and I can't deny that this is a really good experience to game on. It's still a pretty penny though, but of course those are my thoughts, and I would love to hear yours in the comments down below. If you're interested in the X32 FP, I'll leave a link to it in the description down below for you to check out. If you want to see more videos like this one, more reviews, more guides, and a load of other stuff, hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell notification icon. If you want one of your very own OSRTT units built to test monitors like I do, then check it out at osrtt.com, and hopefully very soon there will be the latency tool available there for testing things like mice and keyboards and headsets and a lot of other stuff as well. There's also a load of other links in the description if you want to support the channel, from merch hoodies or t-shirts like this one, or a load of other ones that I designed myself, or just other stuff down there, Overclock UK affiliate links. But yeah, otherwise, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to check out plenty of other videos on the end cards. We'll see you on the next video.